Picture this. It's 1960, a sweltering Chicago television studio. And in just one single hour, the entire playbook for global leadership is rewritten forever. We usually think of history as this neat, inevitable sequence of events, right? But honestly, it's forged by human frailties, totally unseen forces, and massive technological disruption. So in this explainer, we're going to reconstruct the exact moment the political world literally turned upside down.
Today, we're launching an investigative dive into the 1960 presidential debates between John F. Kennedy and Richard Nixon. We're going way beyond that famous black and white footage you've probably seen. We're uncovering the hidden legislative maneuvering, the intense psychological warfare, and the systemic disruptions that forever altered the mechanics of power.
All right, part 1. The screen becomes the king.
To really understand why 1960 changed everything, we have to look at the massive technological wave that made it even possible. The velocity of this change was just staggering. Think about this. In 1950, television was basically a novelty. Only about 11% of American households even had a set. But flash forward just a single decade. That number skyrockets to 88%. We're talking over 40 million sets. This unprecedented surge created a nationwide political audience that literally did not exist in the previous election cycle. And, of course, the broadcast network saw a huge opportunity.
So, when September 26, 1960 rolled around, the audience was absolutely astronomical. An estimated 70 million viewers tuned in. Just wrap your head around that. Politics was transformed into an electronic spectator sport, literally overnight. For the very first time in human history, millions of Americans were evaluating potential leaders not through heavily edited newspaper columns or, distant, crackly radio broadcasts, but intimately, right there in their own living rooms.
Which brings us to part 2, rewriting the broadcast rules.
Now here's a wild detail that almost no one realizes. Bringing Kennedy and Nixon together on screen was actually technically illegal just months before it aired. Yeah, seriously. It required some incredibly high-stakes, behind-the-scenes legislative maneuvering to bypass something called the equal time rule. Officially, this was Section 315 of the Communications Act of 1934. It basically mandated that if a network gave airtime to one legally qualified candidate, it had to afford equal opportunities to all others. It was originally designed to stop networks from playing kingmaker.
But this created an absolute logistical nightmare. If CBS, NBC, and ABC broadcasted a debate between Kennedy and Nixon, the law literally required them to grant equal free airtime to 14 minor party and fringe candidates. I mean, imagine a 16-person debate. It's absurd. So this historic broadcast was completely dead in the water unless the law changed.
So what happened? Well, the networks launched a massive coordinated lobbying effort. The result was a temporary suspension of the equal time provision, which was signed right under the wire in August 1960. By bypassing those 14 fringe candidates, this bipartisan suspension quietly but permanently institutionalized the two-party duopoly on national television. It effectively locked alternative voices right out of the primary medium of political communication.
Let's move on to part 3, sweat, suits, and stagecraft.
With the legal hurdles out of the way, let's pivot to the micro-level human drama unfolding inside Chicago's incredibly hot WBBM TV studio. The visual contrast here was stark. I mean, truly cinematic. Richard Nixon arrived exhausted. He was recovering from a nasty staph infection, and out of sheer pride or maybe just a fatal misunderstanding of the medium, he completely refused professional television makeup. He just used some cheap drugstore powder to hide his 5 o'clock shadow. Plus, he wore a light gray suit that completely washed out against the set, and he was perspiring heavily under those intense studio lights. John F. Kennedy, on the other hand, he treated the studio like a modern battlefield. He was rested, tanned, wearing a highly contrasted dark suit. His team had meticulously calibrated the lighting and temperature beforehand. Kennedy weaponized the camera, while Nixon, he fought it. The visual result on the black and white televisions of that era was devastating. When Chicago Mayor Richard J. Daley saw the vice president's pale, haggard face on a studio monitor, he reportedly uttered this chilling realization. My God, they've embalmed him before he even died. It was that bad. Actually, even Nixon's own mother called immediately after the broadcast just to ask if he was sick.
Part 4. Deconstructing the radio myth.
Because that visual contrast was just so shocking, a legendary myth was born that very night. You've probably heard it. The story goes that radio listeners believed Nixon won the debate, while television viewers chose Kennedy purely because he was handsome. It's a really clean, deterministic narrative, right? It suggests the public was just completely superficial. But as investigators of history, we know it's rarely ever that simple.
Modern scholars have dug deeply into the data, and the crucial revelation here is that this myth, well, it simply doesn't hold up. As historian David Greenberg points out, the idea that Kennedy won only because of his looks just lacks evidence. Kennedy didn't just look better. He sounded incredibly competent. He matched the seasoned vice president fact for fact, proving to everyone watching that he possessed the intellectual weight for the presidency.
The really hidden factor here is the political context of 1960. The public fully expected a contentious, fiery ideological battle, but the reality? Nixon and Kennedy actually shared a profound Cold War consensus. Because they were so ideologically aligned on domestic policy and foreign containment, they couldn't just win on policy alone. So the battleground shifted. It shifted to competence, vigor, and likability. Kennedy's mastery of the visual medium amplified his substance. It definitely didn't replace it.
Finally, Part 5, the permanent image era. The fallout from these 4 debates triggered an absolute tectonic shift, bringing long-term, totally unintended consequences for global leadership. Essentially, it birthed the modern political campaign. The traditional, localized, verbal whistle-stop tour, that began a very sharp decline, and in its place, a brand new class of power brokers emerged, the media advisor and the political consultant. Ultimately, visual aesthetics were permanently weaponized as a vital metric of presidential fitness. How a leader looked while listening suddenly became just as scrutinized as what they said while speaking.
And the technology moved incredibly fast. By the 3rd debate, just a few weeks later, the networks pulled off a monumental virtual split-screen broadcast. They had Nixon in Los Angeles and Kennedy in New York, connected live. This proved the medium's vast new capability to literally shrink the country. It allowed citizens to evaluate 2 men separated by 3,000 miles, right there in real time.
Yet despite that technological triumph, the memory of Nixon's disastrous visual performance cast a long, dark shadow over politics. 16 years, that is how long it took for another televised presidential debate to actually happen. The format was deemed just way too dangerous. Risk-averse candidates realized that one drop of sweat or one poorly tailored suit could literally cost them the free world. Because of that, no incumbent president dared to step foot on a television debate stage again until 1976.
Which brings us to the ultimate unresolved question of our modern era. The 1960 debates fundamentally merged television and politics, proving once and for all that human psychology is deeply, inextricably swayed by the visual. But as we look at the highly curated, meticulously media-trained political landscape of today, we really have to ask ourselves, in an era where image permanently dictates power, are we still electing leaders, or have we simply been casting performers?